Hey everyone, and welcome back. It's funny how often we find ourselves kind of wrestling with this question.
Yeah.
Like, how do you tell the difference between someone who's truly a visionary,
Mm.
like someone who's really trying to push boundaries and make a difference, and then someone who's really good at just like playing the game? You know what I mean?
It's like the age-old question of substance versus style,
Right, yeah.
especially in a world that's so obsessed with image.
Exactly. And that leads us perfectly to our subject for this deep dive. We're going to be talking about Ramy Youssef.
Hmm.
Now, I'll be honest, when I first started looking into him, I was like, okay, this guy's got a Golden Globe. He's got a Peabody Award for his show Ramy. He's directing, he's acting, he's writing, he's producing. Like, is this guy for real? Or is this just some really brilliant marketing?
Right. He's got that recent deal with A24, which is huge, and directing an episode of The Bear. Like, he's definitely making waves.
So let's start with like the foundation of all of this.
Yeah.
Let's talk about Ramy, the show. Like, what is it all about?
You're
For
right.
anyone who hasn't seen it?
Well, at its core, Ramy is about a first-generation American Muslim guy living in New Jersey. And it's really a show about navigating life. Faith, family, dating, all within the context of being a Muslim in America today.
Yeah, and what's cool is it doesn't shy away from those like super specific cultural things.
Oh.
Like there's literally an episode about him trying to abstain from sex during Ramadan while his friends are out there like living it up.
Yeah, and that's what makes it so relatable. Even if you're not Muslim, you can still connect with those universal struggles of like trying to balance your personal beliefs with societal pressures.
Totally. And then you've got his parents who are like this whole other layer of complexity. The dad being more traditional, the mom a little more lenient.
And that dynamic just adds so much depth to the show because it reflects the reality of so many immigrant families, those generational clashes and trying to find your place between two cultures.
Right. It's not just about being Muslim. It's about being a child of immigrants, trying to forge your own identity while still respecting your roots.
Absolutely. And then there are those moments in Ramy that are just like gut punches, like the episode where he finds his grandfather dead on the floor. It's heavy stuff.
Yeah. And it's handled so well.
Yeah.
It's heartbreaking, but also really powerful because it speaks to the show's willingness to tackle difficult subjects head on.
And that's what sets Ramy apart, I think. It's not afraid to be messy, to be real, to show the full spectrum of human experience.
Okay, so Rainey, the show seems to be doing a lot of things right,
Mm-hmm.
but it hasn't been without its criticism.
Right. Yeah, there's been some valid criticism, especially surrounding the portrayal of Muslim women on the show.
Some people feel like the female characters aren't as fully developed as they could be.
And that the show focuses more on the restrictions they face rather than on their own individual experiences and desires.
Which is a fair point. It's like, does Ramy, despite his good intentions, end up kind of perpetuating some of the stereotypes he's trying to challenge?
Yeah, it's a complex conversation, and it raises the question of whose stories get told and how.
Okay, so Ramy, the show is complex and layered. But to really understand it, I think we need to understand the man behind it, right? Like, who is Ramy Youssef, the person?
Yeah, he's an interesting figure. He started out as a stand-up comedian, and his background is Egyptian-American. So he's bringing all of that to the table.
And he's had roles in other shows, too, right? Like, I remember seeing him in the Seedad Run and Mr. Robot.
Yeah, and you can kind of trace his evolution as a performer through those roles, like how his comedic style has developed over time.
It's clear that he's always been drawn to these, like, kind of edgy topics, these uncomfortable truths that he explores through humor.
And that's a thread that runs through all of his work, like
Yeah.
the ability to find humor in the darkness.
He definitely doesn't shy away from controversy.
Yeah.
Remember that Golden Globes acceptance speech where he thanks God and Hulu in the same breath? It's like classic Ramy.
It was unexpected, irreverent, but also somehow super endearing.
Yeah, and that's part of what makes him so fascinating. He keeps you guessing. You never know what he's going to say or do next.
And that unpredictability makes it all the more challenging to figure out what his true motivations are. Like, is he being sincere or is he just playing the game?
Right, it's that constant tension between what's genuine and what's calculated.
Exactly. And that's what we're going to be exploring in this deep dive.
So buckle up, folks. It's going to be a wild ride. Like, he's also said he wants to use his upcoming stand-up tour to raise money for Gaza.
Which is a really interesting move.
Yeah.
Right, because on one hand, it seems like a genuine attempt to use his platform for good.
But then there's that other side where you wonder, like, is it just a PR stunt?
It's hard to know for sure.
Right.
And it brings up this whole question of, like, how do you measure impact versus just intentions?
Right. And that reminds me, he also signed that public letter a couple years ago with other big names in Hollywood calling for a ceasefire between Israel and Gaza.
Yeah, and that was seen by a lot of people as a really powerful statement.
But then, on the other hand, You have things like him wearing a ceasefire pin to the Oscars,
And then that same year, making a joke about freeing the hostages during his SNL monologue.
which to some felt like a weird disconnect, you know?
Right. Like he's trying to have it both ways.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder, like, how aware is he of the power he has, the influence he has, and the responsibility that comes with that?
Yeah. It's tricky because he has said that he wants to be defined more by his personal life than his public persona.
Which is kind of ironic,
Yeah.
right? Because so much of his work is based on his personal experiences.
And he is actually married, to a visual artist from Saudi Arabia.
Oh, wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, he keeps that part of his life very private.
Which is interesting because it creates this sense of like a curated image, you know, like what we see is only what he wants us to see.
And that makes it even harder to figure out, like, what's real and what's not.
Right. And it kind of goes back to that tension we were talking about before, that
Mhm.
tension between the personal and the public.
Yeah, and that's something that plays out a lot in Ramy, too. Like, there's that scene where he's on a date and he's talking about the Arab dad talk he got about sex.
Oh, yeah, I remember that scene.
And it's funny, but it also points to this deeper struggle he has with cultural expectations and feeling like he has to conform.
It's almost like he's using humor to deflect from the more uncomfortable parts of his identity.
Exactly. And that brings us back to this whole question of authenticity. Like, is he being true to himself, or is he more concerned with crafting a certain image?
Right. And if he is kind of self-censoring to appeal to a wider audience, does that make him a sellout or just smart?
It's a tough question. I mean, his upcoming stand-up tour, the one where he's raising money for Gaza, could be seen as a way to kind of bridge that gap, right?
Like an attempt to align his actions with his values.
Exactly.
Okay, so it seems like there's this ongoing struggle for Ramy between like staying true to himself and also playing the Hollywood game.
Yeah, and that's reflected in his work, too. Like, Ramy has gotten a lot of praise for its nuanced portrayal of Muslim American life.
But it's also been criticized for its limited perspective on the experiences of Muslim women.
Right, because focusing primarily on Ramy's point of view, it can unintentionally reinforce certain power dynamics.
And it kind of limits the scope of the story.
Yeah, it's a reminder that good intentions don't always equal perfect execution.
So where does all of this leave us with Ramy Youssef? Like, is he a visionary using his platform to start important conversations?
Or is he just a carefully constructed persona, designed for maximum impact and minimal risk?
It's a really tough question to answer.
Yeah.
I think he's clearly talented,
Mm-hmm.
and he has a unique voice, and he's not afraid to push boundaries.
But whether he's using his platform for good or for self-promotion, ultimately that's something that each viewer has to decide for themselves.
Right. And maybe that's okay. Maybe there isn't a simple answer.
I think it's more about recognizing the complexity of the situation.
And acknowledging that people are multifaceted. They can be both good and flawed at the same time.
Right, and that's what makes this whole discussion so interesting. It's not about judging, it's about understanding.
Yeah, and it's about having those tough conversations about representation and authenticity and responsibility. And it's interesting how his career kind of reflects that. Like, you see him going from these raw stand-up routines to a more polished kind of mainstream persona.
Makes you wonder if that's just a natural progression or if he's deliberately trying to, like, refine his image,
Yeah. And even his upcoming projects seem to play into that. Like, he's got this new comedy series in the works for Netflix called Golf, which feels like a pretty big leap from the whole, like, introspective vibe of Ramy.
Definitely a bold move, for
Yeah.
sure. It'll be interesting to see if he can bring that same level of, like, depth and social commentary to a show about, golf.
I guess that's part of what makes him so intriguing. Like, you never quite know what he's going to do next.
Right. And that unpredictability makes it even harder to figure out what his end game is. Like, is he genuinely trying to, like, push creative boundaries, or is he just chasing the next big opportunity?
It's like he's constantly walking this tightrope between being sincere and being opportunistic. And it's hard to say which way he'll ultimately fall.
Maybe that's the whole point, though. Maybe
Yeah.
he's intentionally blurring those lines,
Yeah.
making us confront our own assumptions about what it means to be a visionary or an artist or even just a public figure.
He does seem to like playing with expectations. Like in his work and even in his personal life. He's mentioned wanting to step back from the spotlight a bit, focus more on his family.
Which is kind of ironic considering how much of his career has been built on sharing his personal life.
Right. It's almost like he's reached this point where he's questioning the cost of fame. Like, what are the trade-offs of putting yourself out there?
Maybe he's realizing that the more you reveal about yourself, the more vulnerable you become to judgment and criticism.
And that vulnerability can be a double-edged sword, especially in today's world where everything is so amplified online.
So it's like he's navigating this new terrain where authenticity is both valuable and kind of a burden.
Which brings us back to that central question we started with. Is Ramy Youssef a grifter, or is he gifted?
Is he a master manipulator or a genuine artist just trying to make sense of the world?
Honestly, I don't think there's an easy answer.
Yeah.
I think he's clearly talented, he has a unique voice, and he's not afraid to push buttons.
But whether he's using his platform for good or for personal gain, that's something that each person has to decide for themselves.
And that's the beauty of it all, right? He's sparked this conversation, this debate about representation and authenticity and the responsibility that comes with having a platform.
He's made us think. He's made us question.
Yeah.
And yeah, maybe even made us a little uncomfortable at times.
And I think that's a valuable contribution in itself.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with this thought. Don't be afraid to engage with these complex figures. Grapple with their contradictions and challenge your own assumptions.
Because it's in that gray area, that space of uncertainty where real learning and growth can happen.
Well said. So on that note, I think it's time to say goodbye to Ramy Youssef. For now, at least.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep those critical thinking skills sharp.